The jungle heat of Puerto Rico clings to the air as a man walks into the ring, not to fight, but to find his soul. What happened that night wouldn't be settled on the scorecards. It was the beginning of something far more profound. Just a few years earlier, George Foreman was unstoppable, the most feared heavyweight on earth. Now, he's flat on his back, gasping for air. Not from a punch, not from exhaustion. He wasn't knocked out, he was stripped down, transformed. 4 years earlier, at 24, he demolished Joe Frazier to become the heavyweight champion of the world. Many years later, he would defy age, doubters, and logic to reclaim the title at 45. But this isn't just the story of a two-time world champion. It's a story of a man who lost everything and found something greater in rebuilding it. Not once, but twice. This is Heavy Lies the Crown. Before he was champion, George Foreman was a ghost in Houston's Fifth Ward, one of America's toughest neighbourhoods, the kind of place where dreams were strangled before they had a chance to be born. Crime was common, poverty was generational, violence wasn't a choice, it was a language. Angry, in trouble, and feared by the time he was a teenager, not in the ring but on the street. He fought for survival, he stole for food, he brawled out of instinct. His fists were tools sharpened by hunger and rage. He had no direction and no faith in anything beyond his two own hands. One night after a robbery went sideways, George found himself sprinting through the dark with sirens screaming behind him. Police dogs were unleashed. He hid under a small house, laying motionless in the cold dirt, covered in filth, breathing through mud. He waited in silence as the chaos swirled above. In that stillness, something shifted. The fear, the exhaustion, the stench of desperation. It all hit him at once, and then came his mother's voice echoing in his mind. No one in this family has ever stolen. No one ever went to jail. That was the moment, the breaking point. I'm no thief, he whispered to himself. Not anymore. Then he crawled out. It wasn't just from beneath the house, it was from the life he'd been living. He came out changed, broken, humbled, but hungry for something more. Days later, he saw an ad, a new path, a government programme offering food, training, discipline, and maybe, just maybe, a way out. Looking for a second chance? Join the Job Corps. That ad was all it took. George packed up and headed to Oregon. He was done stealing, but the fighting, that was harder to leave. He was still a bully, lashing out, pushing people around, just to prove he could. He had no confidence, no purpose, and one night in the day room, the students gathered around a radio, listening to a boxing match, Ali versus Floyd Patterson. They turned to George. You think you're so tough, then be a boxer. He didn't know the rules, didn't even know what a jab was, but he shrugged and said, okay, I will. Soon afterwards he was transferred to Pleasanton, California, home to a Jobs Corps centre with a boxing programme. There he met Doc Broadus. George walked straight up to him and said, I want to be a boxer. Well, he said, you're big enough and ugly enough. Sparring was arranged. Come watch me, George shouted. I'm going to knock this guy out. However, during the sparring he missed wildly, spun off balance, hit the canvas. The gym roared with laughter. George stormed off, thinking to himself, that's it, I'm done with boxing. A few days later, George ran into Doc Broadus. What's happened, you scared? No, I didn't have any shoes. An hour later, Doc came back, boxing shoes in hand. No more excuses. George shrugged, I guess I got a box. In the ring, something shifted. Pain became focus, anger became fuel. Doc and boxing didn't just train his body, they taught him how to think, how to breathe, and how to believe. Back in Houston, George entered his first tournament. He kept winning. In one bout, he swung wildly with his eyes closed and won. That first victory hooked him. Then came the Golden Gloves in San Francisco. He won the opening round. The second was different, it was brutal, he was dropped by a vicious right. Dazed on the canvas, he looked into the crowd. 6 women, 5 women, 4. If I don't get up, he thought, they'll vanish. He forced himself up and won. The momentum built. That's when Doc said, the Olympics are coming. Win gold and you could be the next Cassius Clay. People doubted him. He was raw, inexperienced, but he kept knocking people out. The rule was simple: win and move forward. George made the US Olympic team and flew to Mexico City. One by one, he beat his opponents. Against Italy, a left hand rocked his jaw. George heard a siren and thought he was hallucinating. His opponent hesitated. George didn't. He promptly knocked the guy out. In the Olympic final, he faced the feared Russian. There was Cold War tension. The world was watching. At the bell, George threw a blind jab, opened his eyes, and the Russian was across the ring. And moments later, the ref stopped the fight. George Foreman, Olympic gold medalist, waving a tiny flag, smiling widely, a long way from the day his cousin Rita told him, no one in his family becomes anything, and you won't either. But now he had. From hiding under houses to standing on the podium, he hadn't planned to turn pro until someone said the magic words, you could make millions. He'd escaped the streets of Houston, but a new kind of hunger had taken hold, not for survival, but for domination. His opponents saw another Olympian, green, maybe tough, but untested. They had no idea. Foreman turned professional in October 1969, New York City. His opponent, Dan Waldholm, KO'd by Foreman, and that was his last fight. George had 13 fights in his first year, 12 knockouts. He didn't just hit hard, he hit like a wrecking ball. No finesse, no games, just relentless pressure. He stalked opponents like prey, cut off the ring like a hunter, and left crowds roaring and challengers rattled. In the early 70s, Foreman trained in an Oakland warehouse named The Meat Locker. 15-round sessions, shirtless, in the cold. Inspiring, he said nothing. No instructions, no trash talk, just a blank stare. He'd become cold, surly, distant. He later confessed he'd been modelling himself on his idol, Sonny Liston. One sparring partner recalled he looked like he was enjoying it, and that scared me more than the punches. Critics said he was all muscle, no mind, but George was watching, studying, and grinding. He didn't smile, he didn't talk, he just knocked people out. In the months that followed, Foreman stayed busy. Different cities, different styles, same result. But not every fight came easy. When he faced Gregorio Peralta, the crowd saw something new, resistance. Peralta was slick, composed, and hard to hit clean. He moved, he survived, he exposed flaws. Foreman faded late, struggled with angles, looked human, but he still won. But this wasn't a highlight reel knockout, it was a test, a warning. Foreman was undefeated, but questions lingered. By 1972, his record stood at 37-0 with 34 knockouts. The boxing world could no longer look away, and neither could Joe Frazier. In a tailored suit, Foreman walked into Joe Frazier's camp in Philly, uninvited, unshaken. He didn't say much, he didn't need to. He wanted Frazier to know that the storm was coming. And on January the 22nd, 1973, in Kingston, Jamaica, George Foreman stepped into the ring as the underdog. Frazier was the undefeated heavyweight champion and the man who had beaten Muhammad Ali. Smoking Joe was relentless, dangerous, and expected to win. How could this blunt instrument, who didn't even know how to snap his punches, destroy the man who beat Muhammad Ali?
Who really just threw punches this way, not snapping them, could win.
You could hit Frazier clean and he'd keep coming, like it made him stronger. I hoped he'd die, George admitted later. I didn't want to fight a man like that. George entered the ring first, nervous, staring down, they told me. Psych him out. He stared into Frazier's eyes and prayed, please don't look down and see my knees shaking. Then came the bell. Frazier came out smoking. One of his left hooks landed flush. George said it felt like a bullet. Then Foreman caught him. Boom! And dropped him. Oh no, George thought. He's going to kill me. Frazier got back up, came forward but got dropped again and again. 6 knockdowns in 2 rounds. Each punch sounded like a shotgun blast. Howard Cosell's voice pierced through the airwaves. Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier! George Foreman, heavyweight champion of the world. From that night forward, George Foreman wasn't a rising contender. He was a force of nature. He had the belt, the power, the stage, but something was missing. The world had a new champion, but George Foreman was still trying to figure out who he was. I thought I'd be filled with happiness, but instead I was just hollow. The cheers never came. Instead, Foreman was met with relentless boos, echoing, haunting. They stayed with him, leaving a young champion wondering why power didn't bring love.
Insecure, which might be why he adopted that persona of that surly person.
He'd changed. He hid behind arrogance. At his first press conference as heavyweight champion, George Foreman made the rules clear. No one talks unless I give permission. It wasn't just control, it was theatre, but the world didn't see a performer. They saw a bully. That reputation stuck. He made his first events against Jose Roman, a ranked contender who lasted just 2 minutes. Then came Ken Norton, a tough-as-nails fighter who had broken Ali's jaw. George destroyed him in 2 brutal rounds. He was a force of nature, but every force has its opposite. And George was about to meet his. He was undefeated, unstoppable, and riding high. Failure didn't just feel unlikely, it felt impossible. And George was offered $5 million to fight an old man from Louisville called Muhammad Ali. When asked if he'd keep boxing if he lost to Ali, Foreman nonchalantly repeated the phrase, "I beg your pardon?" When Foreman stepped off the plane in Zaire, he brought more than just power. He brought an Alsatian. To him it was just a dog. To the people it was a symbol of fear, the kind used by Mobutu's police to silence dissent. Before the first punch was thrown, the crowd had already picked their side, and it wasn't Foreman's. In the lead up to the rumble in the jungle, Foreman trained in 100 degrees heat. He chopped trees with an axe, punched tyres strung from branches, and refused cold water, only room temperature, to toughen his gut. It was so intense, sparring partners either quit or faked injuries just to get out of there. Ali wasn't given a chance, but he had other ideas. "George ain't gonna beat me, he's too slow. He don't move, I'll dance all night."
Storm of blindness at the speed of my dancing. I will strike him with my jab. Pooh, pooh, pooh.
And Ali was doing something strange, letting his sparring partners tee off on him. Was it training? Was it madness? Ali promised to donate money and build hospitals in Zaire. The cameras followed him like a shadow. They loved him and kept talking. He'd skip in open workouts and shout, "I'm gonna dance, he won't touch me. How's he gonna catch me?" George heard every word, and he didn't take it lightly. Back at camp, he drilled one thing over and over, cutting off the ring. Not chasing Ali, cornering him. Then came a twist. 6 weeks before the fight, Foreman suffered a cut in sparring.
The guy threw up his elbows to protect himself from Foreman, and Foreman walked into his elbow.
The bout was delayed. "It won't change anything," said Foreman. While George healed in silence, Ali took to the streets, to the markets, to the hearts of the people. He smiled, he danced, he joked and ridiculed George and gave them a chant. "Ali Boumaye, Ali Boumaye." Ali, kill him. Kinshasa, Zaire, 4 a.m. Timed perfectly for the American television. Over 60,000 fans packed into the Stade de 20 Mai. In one corner, George Foreman, the reigning heavyweight champion. In the other, Muhammad Ali, older, written off, the fallen king seeking resurrection. Foreman tried to intimidate him, but Ali just mocked him. You could see Foreman was under Ali's spell as he came out for the first round. Ali danced, taunted, leaned on the ropes. Foreman stalked forward, throwing thunder, 6 punches for every one of Ali's. Round after round, George battered Ali's arms, shoulders, ribs, forehead. He hit him flush, hard enough to make his eyes roll around like slot machines.
Ali's eyes rolled like that, like they were slot machines. He went tick, 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 tick.
Ali leaned and whispered, "The hell you got, George?" His punches were landing, but Ali was still there, calm, composed, unbroken. The heat, the altitude, Ali's genius, it all began to turn the tide. George was punching himself tired. Then came round 8. Ali struck, a quick combination, right hand, left hook, another right. Foreman's legs buckled, he hit the canvas. At the count of 8 he stood, but it was too late. The fight was over. Muhammad Ali was champion again. Ali walked away, arms raised to the sky. He'd done the impossible, defeated the undefeated. The stadium erupted, and Foreman just turned. No protest, no anger. He walked back to the corner, forlorn, empty. A storm that had suddenly gone still. The belt was gone. The mystique shattered. He wasn't a destroyer anymore. He was just a man, beaten for the first time. George didn't take it well.
And he kept saying, I'm still the champion. I don't think I lost.
As the crowds roared for Ali, George Foreman slid quietly out of the ring. No cameras followed him. No reporters chased him. No chants called his name. Just silence. Only months earlier, after destroying Joe Frazier, he'd been the most feared man on earth, but now he walked alone. No belt, no glory, just sweat, heat and 1,000 people looking the other way. It was stark contrast to the night he became champion. When the world leaned in to watch him rise, George wasn't just defeated, he'd been outwitted, embarrassed, bamboozled in front of the entire world. Now they were only watching Ali. Stripped of his bravado, a slow mental breakdown began to unfold. George said, "It devastated my whole life from top to bottom. I couldn't even sleep. I don't feel like a man anymore." Without a title, George didn't know who he was. He was filled with silence, with chaos, women, fame, distractions, trying to prove mostly to himself that he was still a winner, but the myth had been shattered, and the world, who once patted him on the back, now looked away. In the months that followed, George spiraled.
He was out of control.
He tried to reclaim the spotlight through a spectacle, a bizarre exhibition match where he fought 5 men in one night. It was a disaster. Fans booed. Reporters mocked him. What was once fear turned into a farce. Still chasing redemption, Foreman returned to the ring, this time with purpose. He racked up wins over tough contenders. A brutal war with Lyle, where both men were nearly knocked out before George roared back. A rematch with Joe Frazier, where he proved the first time was no fluke. Solid victories over Scott Ledoux, John Dennis and Pedro Augusto. Each win brought him closer to the top again, but something was missing. The aura was cracked. Then came Jimmy Young. By 1977, George Foreman was back in title contention. His opponent was Jimmy Young, a slick defensive-minded fighter with fast feet, sharp counters and nothing to lose. On paper, he wasn't supposed to be a real threat. He was meant to be a stepping stone. But Young didn't fold. He moved, slipped, taunted, made George chase. The ring became a maze and George couldn't find his way through. Then, late in the fight, it happened. George lunged in. Then he hit the canvas. I jumped up, but the damage was done. I lost the decision. The fight went 12 rounds in 100 degrees Puerto Rican heat. But George wasn't just battling Jimmy Young. He was fighting doubt, fatigue, himself. Back in the dressing room in San Juan, the air was thick and still. George paced the floor, drenched in sweat. Not just from the fight, but from something deeper, something rising inside. He had money, fame, everything a fighter was supposed to want, and yet I didn't need boxing anymore. Then I heard, "You can retire and die." Die? I wasn't sick. He was strong. He had everything to live for. He walked faster, trying to shake it off. The tension was rising in his chest like smoke. He paced. His team watched, unsure of what was happening. He made a deal with God. "Let me keep boxing. I'll give the money to cancer, to charity." But the voice answered, "I don't want your money. I want you." That broke him. Tears streamed down his face. Then, without warning, his legs gave out. He was somewhere else. Dropped into blackness. No light, no land, no way out. But it wasn't just dark. It was alive, heavy, present. He wasn't alone. I died. I saw everything I worked for crumble like trash. Then I was born again. At 31, he walked away from boxing, from wealth, from fame. Friends said he'd lost his mind, but George believed he'd found his soul. And in 1978 he was ordained and took his ministry to the streets of Houston. Motorists would stop at red lights, staring at the giant man with a mic, preaching on the sidewalk. The change was undeniable. No longer a scowling destroyer, but a smiling gentleman. In 1984 he opened the George Foreman Youth and Community Centre. One day a woman came to him and said, "George, I'm having trouble with my son." He built a refuge for kids like he once was, a youth centre with a ring, a court, a place to belong. George had peace, but peace did not pay the bills. His savings were drying up and the youth centre was at risk. "I know how to get money," he said. "I'm going back to the ring." The decision shocked everyone. 38 years old now, but George had a plan: become the heavyweight champion of the world again. The odds were long, the road ahead brutal, but the fire was back. He was told, "You can't turn back the clock." "You're wrong, I can come back at any age and be heavyweight champion of the world." He was too old, overweight. The boxing commission made him take endless tests before clearing him to fight. In March 1987, George stepped back into the ring. Some thought it was a joke. "Is this real?" said one announcer. "Am I in the Twilight Zone?" He hadn't fought in a decade. The sport had moved on. Name after name fell. Foreman walked them down with that same old pressure, cold, heavy hands. But this time he smiled when he did it. George Foreman was disarming the world with charm. He starred in commercials, smiled through interviews, and leaned into his image. "If I can't hit you with a punch," he said, "I'll belly bump you." This George was different, older, slower, calmer, but still dangerous. And with every knockout, the whispers grew louder. Could he really come back? Could he fight for the title again? By 1991, the whispers turned into a roar. George Foreman, at 42 years old, was getting a title shot against Evander Holyfield, the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world. Holyfield was young, fast, technical, but that night George proved something. He went 12 rounds with a prime, undisputed champion. "I proved I'm still a fighter," he said, "and I'm not done yet." By 1992, George Foreman had been back in the ring for 5 years. He'd knocked out contenders, gone 12 rounds with Evander Holyfield, proved he still belonged, but he wasn't champion, not yet. And with each fight it was getting harder and harder. Then came Alex Stewart, younger, faster, eager to make a name off a legend. In round 2, Foreman did what he always did. He dropped Stewart twice. The old power was still there, but Stewart got up and kept coming. What followed was 12 rounds of punishment. Foreman's face was battered, swollen and blooded. The worst of his career. His eyes puffed shut, his jaw swollen, his legs heavy, and by the final bell, he had won the decision, but he looked like a man who had lost. He was 43, still chasing the title, still fighting the clock. And for the first time, the wear was showing. The dream was still alive, but the road was starting to take its toll. Foreman got a shot against Tommy Morrison. Young, fast, flashy. Morrison didn't trade punches that night. He boxed, he moved, he clinched, he scored points. For the first time in his comeback, George looked his age. Commentators said at the end, "George, you thrilled us, you've inspired us, you gave us a comeback we never expected. But maybe it's time to hang up the gloves, go back to the quiet life before the ring takes more than just rounds from you."
Is this it? What about wife Joan, and what are you going to do?
Well, I've got a date with Kentucky Fried Chicken.
In 1994, boxing had moved on. Evander Holyfield, the man who once beat Foreman, had lost his belts to a younger, hungrier fighter, Michael Moorer. Moorer was 26, undefeated. Southpaw, he was sharp, fast, and carried real power, and now he was the heavyweight champion of the world. Fight night, Las Vegas, November the 5th, 1994. At 45 years old, George Foreman wasn't just fighting an opponent, he was fighting Father Time. The younger champion unleashed volleys of punches in waves. Foreman knew he didn't have the speed to answer back in kind, so he just waited. He held back the full force of his right hand, disguising its danger. He wanted the champion to grow comfortable, to stop moving, to stay in the pocket, to believe the old man had nothing left. There was a sense that Michael Moorer had convinced himself Foreman's power wasn't a threat. First, he fought cautiously, circling, jabbing, building points. But now, he looked like a man who believed he could finish the fight. He could stop Foreman. He stood in front of Foreman and traded punches, confident that the old man had nothing left. It was a critical miscalculation. For 10 rounds, Moorer had been lulled into a false sense of security, absorbing slow, seemingly harmless right hands. But that was the trap. George had been holding back, baiting him in, playing a role of decoy. Then suddenly he let the right hand go. A short, clean, thunderous shot detonated through Moorer's guard. He collapsed instantly, stunned silence, then disbelief. The referee stepped in and waved it off, and in the neutral corner, George Foreman dropped to his knees in prayer. 20 years after losing the title in Zaire, he had just done the unthinkable, regained the heavyweight championship of the world at 45 years old, not with youth, not with speed, but with faith, with patience, with purpose. This was not just an historic moment in boxing, but one of the most extraordinary achievements in all sports. 2 decades later, the same title he lost in the jungle was now his again. After reclaiming the crown, Foreman kept fighting, but the magic was fading. A few more bouts followed. Then came Shannon Briggs. Foreman outlanded him, outworked him, maybe even outboxed him, but the judges gave it to Briggs. George said nothing, just nodded, quietly accepting that time had finally called his name. At 48 years old, George Foreman stepped out of the ring for the last time. Not with a knockout, not with a title, but with peace. He became a commentator, a best-selling author, a health advocate, and the face of a grill that made more money than any punch he ever threw. A father to 10, a preacher, a mugger-turned mentor. The Job Corps rescued him from the gutter, he said. It didn't change his life, it gave him one. It gave him purpose, discipline, and a foundation to chase something bigger. The path led to Olympic gold in 1968, to 2 reigns as heavyweight champion of the world, but more than anything, it led him back to himself. George Foreman became a symbol of hope, proof that it's never late to start over. Life isn't behind you, he said, it's always ahead of you. He earned over 300 million, enough to fund a youth centre 1,000 times over. But Foreman's greatest success wasn't measured in wealth, it was measured in growth, in character, in the quiet refusal to let anyone else define who he was. He achieved everything he set out to do, but more importantly, he found who he truly was. George Foreman wasn't afraid to pursue life, he was born to conquer it.